About 2 years ago, right around Halloween, I was babysitting for these two ladies who each had a son. They wanted to go out, so I stayed at one of their houses and watched their boys. It was around 8 p.m. and the boys were sitting on the couch, playing on their iPads and whatnot, when somebody had knocked on the door. I asked the boys if anyone was supposed to come over, and they both said no. I then go over and check the peephole in the door, and it's some guy in a gray hoodie, deliberately hunched over so I can't see his face. Immediately, I'm like, hell no, and I don't say anything and just start pacing around because I don't want to give him any inclination that we're inside. A couple of minutes later, I check outside the little window right through the curtains, and he's gone. I don't want to spook the kids anymore, and there weren't any more knocks, so I just kind of let it go as just a prank. Cut to a few hours later, and the moms get back home. They ask me how everything was, and I say that the kids were really great, but somebody had come to the door. They asked me what time, and I said it was around 8, and one of the moms started totally freaking out and then going through her phone. The other one tells me that right around that time, somebody had been making some really strange phone calls to them on a blocked number. They had apparently disguised their voice and then were saying things like,
"I can see you through your window."
They didn't really think it was serious because it didn't really make any sense in the context of where they were, but in retrospect, they were almost positive that it was actually me that he was looking at through the window. They escorted me to my car and I then touched base a little later, and apparently nothing strange ever happened after that. But I'm just really glad that I didn't open that door, because I have a really bad feeling deep in my gut that it would have been really bad. I honestly don't even know how to start this story. I was kind of young at the time, around 7 or 8 years old, but old enough to know exactly what was going on. I lived in a pretty decent neighborhood, but my family was in the process of moving away. There was a large mixture of families with children and retired seniors living on my street. There was a neighborhood babysitter who always took care of my younger sister when she was too young to go to school. She also happened to babysit me as well on multiple occasions. She was always kind of rude to us. She was a pudgy lady with 2 annoying sons and a very weird husband. A lot of the local kids had gotten taken care of by her, so my parents always trusted her to take care of us. Everything was somewhat normal, except for the fact that she was always kind of rude to anyone that wasn't her own kid. Her kids were pretty misbehaved. They were always fighting, hitting each other with plastic swords, and always screaming at the top of their lungs. At one point, the younger toddlers had to take a nap, and she actually forced all of the children except for her own kids to sit in a corner and be quiet. Pretty odd behavior for a babysitter, but we never really thought too much about it. Another thing to mention is that she always took naps while babysitting. As in, she never paid any attention to the kids. She just shooed them away and fell asleep. She was also really notorious for giving her sons chocolate milk and telling all the others that they could just have water. My sister and I just tried to ignore it, but eventually we were pretty annoyed of it. My sister had a pretty loud mouth, so she told my mom how she treats the kids she babysits versus her own children. I'd also like to acknowledge that my sister had just turned 4 at the time, so she really wasn't that great with words. My mom was pretty angry that the babysitter did that, but she just let it slide, as we were going to be moving in about a month, and she didn't really know if we were being completely honest about it, as we were little kids, and sometimes kids make this stuff up. The house that we ended up moving to is the same house that I spent a really large majority of my childhood and teenage years in. Things were pretty normal once we transitioned into the new house. That is, until we got the calls. We changed our phone numbers, so we weren't really sure how the babysitter and her husband found it so quickly. She would literally call every single day saying that we needed to pay her and that we owed her money. She was apparently just really angry that we had moved, and we were currently on the lookout for a new babysitter that was closer to home. My parents received these calls literally every day, and they always consisted of the babysitter or her husband always screaming, which meant that I could hear the voicemails and calls very clearly. They just kept harassing us, and my parents grew agitated and really worried. One night it all ended at around 10 p.m. when my sister and I woke up to the loud sound of banging on the front door. It had continued for a good 10 minutes, and it was very loud. My sister was just totally freaked out, so I decided to go see if my parents were awake. And they were. They were just opening their eyes and kind of confused as to what was going on. My dad had told my mom to stay upstairs as he foolishly went downstairs to get the door as I nervously stood at the railing. My sister had stayed in the bedroom because she was totally unaware as to what was actually happening. When he opened the door, I felt absolutely sick and totally terrified. There was my babysitter and her husband, who managed to not only find our address but also our phone number. The husband started screaming at the top of his lungs, yelling,
"You owe us money. Pay us."
and shaking a knife while he said it. Yes, he actually had a knife in his hand. My dad told him that we weren't going to pay them and he warned him to leave unless he wanted the cops to be called. Well, he didn't care. My dad went to close the door, but he stuck his foot in it, attempting to get inside our house. My babysitter was also yelling, but I couldn't really hear what she had said. We had a phone upstairs, so my mother quickly and quietly decided to call the cops, all while my dad struggled to get the door closed. Once he did, the banging and screaming just continued. They wouldn't leave our property. I was so freaked out, so I started crying. My sister saw me crying and she started to do the same. Long story short, about an hour after they left, the cops finally arrived, having just missed them. My parents knew their info based on the fact that they used to babysit us, so it wasn't too hard to track them, and they were indeed arrested. I had always wondered if the night that they did this, if their children was home alone or at a sleepover, especially at a time so late. Regardless, they were released from jail a few days later, but were not allowed to step foot near our house. I'm not sure if the woman still babysits or not, but if she does, I feel really terrible for the kids. We never really knew what their intentions were that night. My dad just saw the knife and just knew that they were up to no good. All I can really say is, to the psychotic babysitter and her crazy husband, I really pray and hope to never see either of you again. The story that I'm about to tell is pretty difficult for me to talk about for two reasons. One is that the main part took place when I was around 4 or 5 years old, which makes it really difficult to remember all of the details surrounding the story, which is part of the reason that it's haunted me for over 20 years. The other reason is the story makes me feel really uneasy to even really think about, and this might be only the third time I've ever really told it in full. So a little bit of background to this story is that I was born and raised in an extremely close big family. We all lived within about a mile from each other around a really large park in a small Texas town. Now, my family was pretty jam-packed full of aunts and uncles, and I'd say that I saw them all at least once a week during my entire childhood. I really can't stress enough just how close we all were growing up, and also how trusted they all were, as it plays a really important part to this story. So the story came up recently between my mother, older brother, and I, because I had opened up about a series of nightmares that I've basically been plagued with for as long as I can remember. These nightmares are always very similar and basically always consist of me as a small child in my childhood home, always attempting to escape my house while something horrible chases after me. The something is never actually visually seen, but it's more like I sense this massive looming person reaching out to me from the dark, and it always catches me before I can ever get outside. This usually always results in me waking up in a sweat. These dreams always seem to somehow center around these very vague yet oddly detailed memories of a babysitter that I once had. Here's where it gets really odd. The memories I have are almost like dreams. I very specifically remember all of the details of what was happening and the feelings I had, but everything else was just totally out of reach. That goes for the babysitter herself as well. I remember that it was a white female who was middle-aged, but I can't for the life of me recall her face. In my memories, it's like I never really got a good look at her. The very two specific incidences that I can remember were definitely not happy ones. For the first one, I remember that whenever I would get in trouble, I would be forced to sit outside on the back porch in just shorts and a t-shirt, and during winter. I remember this because I would always shiver and just sit there quietly, scared that my complaining would cause even more problems. The second memory, well, that was even worse to me. The babysitter seemed to really love this game that she made up. She would turn all of the lights off in the house and would go deeply hide in one of the back rooms. I was left in the front room, and I was told that if I wanted food or to watch TV, I had to find her first. I never had any idea where she was hiding, and if I ever found her, she would jump out screaming at me like a mad woman and then chase after me. I can distinctly remember her laughing at my fear. I remember pretty often being so frozen with terror that I would sit on the ground near the front door, way too scared to find her. No matter how long I waited, she would never come out of hiding, no matter how hungry I got. I specifically remember this one time pretty well. I was so little and scared. I was whimpering as I slowly built up the bravery to walk to the back hallway to look for her. My hunger felt deadly at this point, and I really needed to find her. I checked all of the bathrooms, bedrooms, and closets, but nothing. She was nowhere. I remember standing in my parents' bedroom trying to figure out where she could be. That is, when I saw her. She was this really dark shape under the big bed, peeking right at me from under the bed skirt. We just stared at each other, neither one of us moving. I couldn't make out her face, but I just knew that she was smiling at me. She was like this crazy feral animal under there. I remember her sliding herself along the floor so fast. I screamed and turned to run as she then made it to her feet, and then the memory goes completely dark. I don't know what happened after that, and that actually scares me just as much as the memory that I do have of the event. I never shared these memories with anyone because they seem so distant, and I often actually wondered if they were even real. One day when I was in my 20s, I decided to mention the nightmares to my mother and brother when we were just sitting around talking during one of the weeks where my brother and I were both home from college. We would often do this to tell funny stories and remember all of the kids we knew from when we were children. Then, I decided to ask my mom about the babysitter. She seemed really confused. She told me that she never hired babysitters for either I or my brother, and because of how big and close my family was and how protective my mom was of us, she never trusted anyone but family to watch us. My aunts and grandmother were the absolute opposite of the woman I remember. Loving, kind, fun, and always treated me like their own children. I could never in a million years imagine them doing those things to me. My mom genuinely seemed confused about this story. She told me that she couldn't even begin to imagine who I was talking about. With her certainty and with the memories being so vague in important places, I had decided that I must have just imagined it all. Then one day, my brother brought it up again while we were driving. Yeah, I remember that," my brother said, with concern in his voice. "No, I actually remember seeing you get taken outside and being forced to sit there, and I thought it was so terrible. I don't know why we never told anyone." He too had no memory of who the woman was, but he remembers feeling defenseless over the entire thing. He only had vague memories of the horrible game that she would play, but pointed out how he has absolutely no memory of her ever targeting him with her torment. He remembers the events as if he were an audience member. He did, however, remember things that I didn't. This included that I often got in trouble because I would often use my imagination to tell stories, and apparently the babysitter would often get mad about it when she realized it wasn't true, and this would then result in me getting kicked out of the house. I just want to point out that my brother is only 1 year older than I am, so he too would have been very little when this happened. I've honestly really thought about bringing it back up to my mom, but I honestly trust that she just has no idea who I'm talking about. And I really don't want to make her feel horrible about something so long ago that she clearly has no idea about. I just really wish I could understand what the hell happened and who the hell this person was. My brother never brought it back up again after, But he told me that at the time he just played it off to being so young and just misunderstanding whatever was happening. All I do know is babysitter from my nightmares. Whoever you are, and if you're even real, I pray to God that we never meet again, not even in my sleep. It was a very long time ago. It all happened back in 1973. It was summer, I was 6 years old, and we were living on Monica Lane in Madison, Wisconsin. The thing is, I sort of recalled it but never really put two and two together until a few months ago when I was talking to my mom, who then went into great detail about it. I was a very gregarious child. Outgoing, extroverted, pretty much friends with anyone. It was at the time a middle-class neighborhood, and 3 houses down from ours on the same side of the street was a huge park. My mom was a nurse and my dad was a salesman, but my mom worked second shift at Meritor while my dad worked days. Now, I rarely ever really had a babysitter, only if they went out for dinner or a movie or something. But they did go out pretty often, and there were always older kids in the neighborhood to babysit. There was this one sitter who I really liked who lived a few blocks or so away, and they were down the street a little bit. Vicky had babysit a few times before that, and it was pretty uneventful. She'd play games with me and do my hair, play dress up, pretty basic stuff. So anyhow, one day I'd gone with friends down to the park. I remember that there was a ball field at the time and a sandlot next to the field. My friends wanted to play on the monkey bars, but I wanted to play in the sand. I looked at the sandbox and my babysitter Vicky was standing there. I told my friends that I was going to go to the sandbox and then ran off. We had played in the sand building a castle, and then she had asked me if I wanted to go get something cold to drink. It was really hot and I of course said yes, so she takes my hand and then we start walking to her place. She then started telling me about her puppies and asking if I wanted to play with them. Of course, I start to get really giddy, and now I can't wait to get to our house. This is where my memory had stopped, and after my mom told me what happened, the rest of it totally flooded back. My mother just happened to be talking to my sister and I about some of the places we lived, and we got to Monica Lane. I told her that I remembered the park and how big it seemed, and then she asked me if I remember being kidnapped there. I immediately thought that she was kidding, and then the look on her face told me otherwise. She said that it was around 5 in the afternoon and one of my friends had come to the door to ask me to come back outside, sure that I had gotten bored, and then walked back home. When my mom checked the house though and realized I wasn't there, she sprints to the park screaming my name. After going around asking several of the kids if they'd seen me with no clue, she went to the ball field and she asked some of the older boys if they'd seen me. One of the boys, I guess around 14, said that he'd seen a younger woman playing with a girl that fit my description in the sand, and that she then walked off in the general direction, and that was really all he knew. My mom ran across the street to one of the houses and asked to use their phone, and then called the police. By the time the police got there, my dad had come home and some of the neighbors were trying to help my mom find me. So there's this search party out looking for me, now screaming my name and knocking on doors. The police had gone back to the park to ask the boys if they knew who had been with me and if they knew who she was. Between the boys and the neighbors, they had figured out who it was that had led me off, but I honestly have no idea how they figured it out. The police and the entourage then go to her home and then knock on the door. She came to the door and she told them she hadn't seen me and that she'd been home all day. The police asked if they could come in, and for some weird reason, she said okay. They went through the house and then they went to the basement, and that's when they found me. That's what my mom knew, and then I remembered. It was literally like a floodgate had opened, and I then started crying. At 6 years old, you sort of just trust everyone, and she'd been in our home. I had never got a bad feeling from her before, and neither did my parents. But when we walked into her house, I remember that cold holy crap feeling washing over me and getting very worried. I remember starting to cry and saying that I wanted to go home over and over. She takes me into her kitchen and then gets me a glass of water and a tissue. I can hear the sound of dogs barking, and next to the kitchen is an open stairway. It then goes down to where the barking was coming from. She starts trying to convince me into going downstairs, then telling me that there's all sorts of toys and games down there. I reluctantly agree, and she then grabs my hand to head down the stairs. The dogs are going nuttier, and then I start screaming. At this point, Vicky's getting freaking bizarre. She's now screaming at me. "Shut the hell up! If you don't shut up, I'll throw you in the cage with the dogs and they're gonna eat you." Then she starts dragging me down the stairs, all the while I'm still screaming. I was scared out of my mind at this point. I remember crying so hard I was hyperventilating, and I'm screaming so bad that I'm not even making a sound. Vicky then flips a switch and starts being syrupy sweet to me, trying to calm me down. She tells me that she was just playing a game with me, and she tells me she wants to play hide and seek with me. Vicky must have been relatively skilled at calming me down, because the next thing I know, I hear knocking on the door from upstairs, and I wasn't crying anymore. The houses were all the same sort of tract houses that Sears used to sell. Not huge, but not small, but you could hear just about everything at any spot in the house. I keep hearing the knocking, and she tells me that it's just her friends, that they're coming to play hide and seek with us. Vicky somehow convinced me to let her put a piece of masking tape right over my mouth so that I wouldn't make a sound, and then she lifted me into this big wooden box next to the kennel. She put a really big pile of blankets over me and told me to be really quiet so they didn't find me. The whole time of this, the dogs were going batshit crazy, but for some reason, when she calmed me down, they calmed down too. They still looked incredibly mean, but they were no longer frothing at the mouth, and they were only slightly growling now, until the knocking started. I remember scrunching in there, totally confused as to what's going on, still scared and convinced that the dogs were going to get out and then eat me. I was crying again, and also hyperventilating. I remember removing the tape from my mouth because I couldn't breathe, but I remember I needed to be quiet because I was so afraid of what she'd do to me if I screamed. I laid in that nasty smelly box next to a big bag of dog food, sweating to hell, with lots of tears rolling down my face. I sort of pushed the blankets to the side, but only enough so that I could pull them back over me if someone came. I recalled thinking about my dad and just really wondering if he'd ever come find me. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, I can hear what sounds like adults yelling my name. They come down the stairs and the dogs are going absolutely batshit yet again. Over and over, men are yelling my name, and then I hear a man then say,
"If you don't shut those freaking dogs up, I will."
I was in a really large storage box with tape hanging off my mouth when they opened the lid. I can distinctly remember a very nice man asking me my name and if I was doing okay. I don't really remember answering him in anything other than screams and tears, and then grabbing his neck so hard that my dad had to practically pry me off of him. I remember my parents taking me to the hospital to be checked out, and that's all I really remember. My mom said that Vicky was then found guilty of attempted kidnapping, and the last she knew that she was apparently in prison, but couldn't really remember the last time she heard anything. We moved from that area shortly after, and I haven't been back since. I do know that my mom said that her parents were really odd, but they didn't really know them. She had met Vicky from the neighbors that used her as a babysitter, and they had never really heard anything bad of her, and that I always seemed happy with her. She lived in the general neighborhood, but it would have been 2 blocks over and 1 block down. Mom said they never picked her up, she always walked over. Whenever they'd get home, they'd drive her home, but never really noticed anything out of the ordinary. Mom and Dad only met her parents when they came to the door to ask for forgiveness, that Vicky hadn't really meant to do anything bad, and that she was a good girl. My mom said that my dad picked up her dad by the shirt and told them if they ever come on our property ever again, he'd kill them. I remember her name and sort of what she looked like, but I don't think I'd have any idea who she was if she walked up to me. Hopefully I'll never see her again though.